Welcome everyone to today's webinar. This is part 2 of a session that we had started last month. It's changes coming to CMMC and DoD cybersecurity. If you've not seen the first webinar, it is still available on our Exostar resources site. And your hosts today will be Bob Metzger and Scott Armstrong. First, just a few housekeeping items. The webinar is scheduled to last about 45 minutes to an hour. We'll always stop at the top of the hour just to respect everybody's time. That will include Q&A if we have time to get to the pre-submitted Q&A questions. All participants will be muted just so that we can speak uninterrupted as the speakers. And for questions that have been pre-submitted, we're going to try to get those to those at the end of the session. If we don't have time, we'll follow up over the next few days via some emails. In case of an outage, please wait for a minute and refresh the page. We've yet to have this happen, but just in case, we always like to say that. Now, for your convenience, there's a link in the YouTube description to a glossary of commonly used terms and acronyms. Sometimes when we start dealing with cybersecurity and the federal government, we tend to speak in acronyms, so that reference is there for you. Just as an aside, there's a poll that will also be available down in that description as well, that we'd like you all to answer the poll questions by the end of the webinar. It gives us great feedback on what we can do to improve, what you might want to be hearing next, and things of that nature. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand via the Exostar resource library, and as well as the same YouTube link. And if you'd like to speak to one of our industry experts, request a copy of the slide deck, just reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com, or you can use the live chat feature on our corporate website as well. Now on to the speakers. I'm the least important one here, Bob Metzger, who he heads the DC office for Rogers, Joseph, and O'Donnell. He is our guest speaker today. He has got a fantastic background, not only in cybersecurity, but in federal contractual matters as well, and how they all kind of intersect, and is quite familiar with CMMC and all the initiatives in the DoD space as well. Bob, well, first on to the agenda, just a quick high view. So we're going to be covering most of these topics, and this is going to be Bob's turn time to shine. And I'll turn it over to him at this point, and then we'll return back for Q&A later. Bob, on to you.
Thank you for the introduction. And again, I'd like to thank Exostar, you and Lisa Remsa for organizing this. And I want to thank, of course, all of those who attend the program and who might listen later. I am an attorney in private practice. I've been very active in cyber and supply chain and other security matters. For some years, I've been a consultant to the MITRE Corporation. In that role, I was a co-author of the 2018 Deliver Uncompromised report that figures to some extent in what has become CMMC. I continue to do work as a consultant for MITRE on other contemporary security problems. What I say in the program that follows will be my personal opinion and should not be attributed to any organization with whom I am or have been affiliated, or to any client. Next slide, please. So let's go jump one. I want to start again with a little bit of a reminder of why we're here, and it's really important. Over on the left, you'll see a cover of the Deliver Uncompromised report. We had a lot of useful and timely insight that is timeless still. And the point I want to make here as we look at this slide is that the problem that threatens the defense industrial base is larger than the exfiltration of government information, which is supposed to be kept confidential. Our supply chains, and that includes you, the contractor, and you, suppliers, are exposed to multiple threat vectors. Adversaries can combine operations using several of those. Nation-state adversaries have a number of objectives, which include, of course, the stealing of intellectual property. But their targeting is not limited to matters of military significance. We also have to appreciate that apart from cyber breach that may cause the loss of protected information, Other forms of malware can introduce latent vulnerabilities, and we've seen some painful examples in the last year or two of where software supply chain has been corrupted with unfortunate effects. We also have some reason to expect or predict that certain types of malware will not just deny information or steal it, but could be used to cause cyber physical harms, meaning that systems that control factories, industrial control systems and the like, they could be compromised in a way that would advantage an adversary. We also, of course, have seen in the last year or two ransomware rise to the top of the list. And every company that's listening to this program should appreciate that the exposure they have to a ransomware attacker is not limited to controlled unclassified information. It's not limited to the parts of your business that may do work for the Department of Defense. Ransomware attackers, often criminals, can look to the whole of your system and can not only deny you access to the system, but can steal information to make it available to rivals, to embarrass you, or to publish it and cause you significant legal exposure if, as often is the case, the sensitive data that's been stolen includes protected personal information. Why would I raise this at the start of a program about CMMC? Well, for all of the turmoil and trouble, effort, and initiative in CMMC, it addresses part of these problems, but only part. And so one of the messages I'm trying to communicate here is that responsible companies, smart companies, prudent companies, they're the ones that are going to look to comply with the DFARS and other contractual requirements. They're going to look to CMMC as a setting process and standards for cybersecurity. They will want to demonstrate that they've satisfied those standards and achieved required process. But that's not the end of the challenge. I strongly recommend that companies consider what we could call the larger or holistic challenge of enterprise security in today's difficult and threatening time. Next slide, please. I meant to mention at the outset that I've also served on a panel of the Defense Science Board. The one I was on produced the Cyber Supply Chain Report in 2017. And in an earlier DSB study, there was calculus generated to help understand risk. And although it seems kind of dated, being originated in 2013, it's still highly relevant. And essentially, risk is a function of threat and vulnerabilities and consequences. And we could spend the next hour talking about each of those elements and their permutations. But the point here is this. Recent events show that in all of those categories, threats, vulnerabilities, and consequences, things have gotten worse in the last year than they were the year before, and they were probably worse then than before. For all the effort that we've made to invest in cyber to understand vulnerabilities, to mitigate consequences, the stakes continue to go up, the threats continue to proliferate and aggravate, the vulnerabilities continue to be created or found and exploited. And again, I'm trying to make this point as to CMMC. There's what you have to do for CMMC as a matter of compliance. But if you go beyond compliance and start thinking about enterprise risk management, CMMC is a piece of it, but just a piece. And companies that want to protect their enterprise value, avoid cost disruption, embarrassment, or regulatory consequences of a ransomware attack. I won't say that CMMC is the starting place, but it is included among other things, maybe many other things that ought to be done. Now, if you're listening and you may be thinking, well, gosh, I'm a medium to small company. I mean, it's already a lot to ask for CMMC. How can I do this? I understand the difficulty and the costs. I'm very concerned about that. I have some ideas, which I hope to suggest later, as to how those might be dealt with. But the truth of the matter, as shown by evidence widely known as well as evidence that's classified, is that no one is safe from these threats, and they can occur at any time. and they can be disabling or enterprise destroying, no matter where you fit into the defense supply chain, whether you're a COT supplier or otherwise, whether you supply medical devices to the VA or DoD, or whether you're supplying systems for the F-35. It's everybody's problem. It's not going away. There are no magic bullets. It's a combination of technology, of process, of policies, of training, people, resources, and commitment. And CMMC ought to help us kind of get on the way, but it's just part of the goal, not all the goal, in my personal opinion. Next slide, please. And next slide. You know, in my earlier presentation, I spent a little bit of time on the 3 slides that follow, and I'm going to collapse that discussion here because many of you may have heard it. This is the interim rule that came out in September. There's 3 parts to it, and 2 parts matter right now, and they're going to continue to matter a lot. And that is the 19 and 20 clause that are represented by the 2 columns in the middle of the page. The 19 clause essentially says that companies have to prepare a self-assessment using a DoD specified method of their compliance with SP 800-171. And it also says in 20 that you have to submit that to DoD Supplier Performance Risk System. You have to submit your score, as well as tell them the system that you reviewed and give them time when you think any gaps in your compliance will be closed. Now, if we were to just focus on those 2 center columns and think about nothing else, those are very important, and they are not going anywhere. Whatever happens to the remainder of CMMC, how, when, by whom, or what, and to accomplish what, I think those center columns are going to remain in place, and they are very significant. They're significant because they're telling every company that gets these clauses that they have to prepare a system security plan, that they have to do a self-assessment, that they have to score themselves and report it, and they have to expect that it could be used by DoD in the decision of whether they are a responsible contractor. And all of these things acquire more importance in light of the initiative of the Justice Department announced earlier this month to conduct a civil cyber fraud initiative. I'll talk about that a little bit later in more detail, but I'll say this. Anytime you submit something to the government, which is a representation of your score or compliance or plans with respect to cyber or other contractual requirement, the fact that you are making such a representation to the government creates a little exposure that the government or a whistleblower might come after you if it turns out that you made those submissions and knowing that they were untruthful. Well, because of this new civil cyber fraud initiative, there's a little more likelihood that the government might come after you, more likelihood still that whistleblowers may seize upon what they think to be a fraudulent act and report it. And almost certainly, within those who are concerned with governance and compliance within organizations, they're going to be a little more careful, and they should be, to make sure that what is submitted to the government just on the self-assessment, just on the SIPR score, is right and can be documented and defended. Because you won't want to be in a position, if anybody makes a false claimed accusation, you will not want to be in a position of trying to explain or justify or rationalize your acts after the allegation is made. You're going to want to have it locked down of confidence, no matter what anybody says. You can prove that you acted truthfully, honestly, responsibly, and so forth. Next slide, please. So, you know, one of the things that we have to face truthfully is that the CMMC construct, as was announced in the last administration and built out, I think it has become to be seen by the current administration as too big, too much, and too far. And it's clear that the current administration is worried about the cost across the broad span of the defense industrial base. It's worried about the feasibility of these required measures for a sizable number of companies measured in the thousands. It is very concerned that unless actions are taken, that the impact upon small businesses will be to drive some away. And it certainly is concerned that if small businesses already in the system leave because they can't absorb these costs, it's going to be harder still to attract innovators. And this administration and this Department of Defense places great emphasis upon capturing and exploiting the innovative capabilities of the American technology base in order to give us areas of data or information or other advantage, which we need in what are dangerous times today. Let's look at the practice progression. From a conceptual level, I think this is wonderful stuff. I mean, it recognizes that there is indeed a progression in maturity, going from basic cyber hygiene to advanced or progressive cyber hygiene across the 5 levels of CMMC. And as one would expect, at each level, there should be more that's required in terms of practices and policies. It becomes more demanding as you go up the stairs, if you will. Well, let's step back a little bit and let's suppose that there are 300,000 companies that are in the defense industrial base. And let's suppose that 25% of those are actually handling controlled unclassified information, or more importantly, perhaps controlled technical information. So if it's just 25% of those 300,000 that are going to be subject to that level 3, well, that's a lot of companies. If it's 20%, it's 60,000. If it's 25%, it's 75,000. I'm not doing my math. Well, are you really? I mean, is it realistic to find a way to go to 75,000 companies with accredited assessors working to established standards with clear scoping guidance? Is it really feasible to find the number of assessors who can go to all those companies and examine them against those 130 practices and policies? And if you could do it, how long is it going to take to do it? And if you do it, what's the total cost of the exercise, and to what extent are you actually achieving results in improved security that are worth the effort and the expenditure, both on the government side and the industry side? I think this is important. I think we should do it. But I'm trying to express what I think are some of the doubts that have surfaced, at least in some parts of the administration. Doubts which I believe are going to lead to some changes of CMMC. These are not going to be changes to abandon CMMC, but as I've said before, there is a need to rationalize it. Putting out charts, graphs, and having plans and ambitions that are very large is terrific. But if you don't have the resources to do it, and the dysfunctional consequences of the attempt are unacceptable, well, then you need to change your reach. You need to reconcile the reach to the resources, and you need to be focusing upon the things that are both doable and important. And those each have important implications. Let's go to the next slide, please. The schedule. Well, I mean, this is an illustration of the problem. I went through this last time. If you just went through level 3 down the right chart, I think the total is 40,000 assessments between FY21 and FY25. That's a very large number. We have 5 C3 PAOs at the moment, and 150 provisional assessors. And the AB is doing some great work, and the provisional assessors have learned a lot and deserve their status. And I know that the C3 PAOs have invested a lot and accomplished a lot. But if resources on the assessment side are not going to be enough to reach the number of companies who now would need to be assessed, well, there's only so much you can do to increase the number of assessors. But there's a lot you can do to change the pace or timing or even the selection of the companies to be assessed. A level 3 before, was a proposition where anybody that got controlled unclassified information was subject to level 3. And level 3 was a build on beyond the present baseline of NIST SP 800-171. And I agree that every company that's at level 3 ought to satisfy 171. And I personally like a lot the additional 20 practices and policies that are in CMMC maturity level 3. But that sum of the total number of practices and policies, the expense and difficulty of certain of them, including several that are in the plus 20, those things, on the debit side seem to suggest that this is going to be way too hard, way too expensive for too many people. And then if you look at the resource side, you're saying, I'm not going to have enough people to do it. Well, something's got to give. And the complexity of reconciling resources and requirements, objectives, and constraints, in a situation where the threat remains so the risk remains so great. This is really hard. And the fact that it is so hard actually, I think, explains why DoD has frustrated so many of us for so many months in considering what to do with CMMC without telling us. It isn't that they don't care. I think they care a lot. It is that it's really hard to decide among very difficult choices. And until those decisions are actually made, well, there's really not much you can say. You start talking about things that are, rebutted by an announcement made a week later. That's stupid. So I think their challenge is to try to get the recommendations in place, get them approved, and take what's approved and turn it into courses of action, then come up with communications plans that tie back to the course of action, run those through the traps internally of all the agencies and entities in DoD that will want to opine, and there are many. And then at that point announce, and then once you announce, that's when you actually have to get started doing this, making these changes. No changes to CMMC are self-effectuating. Everything requires effort on the industry AB, on the part of the AB. So a lot of affected players, stakeholders, resources, a lot of people who are responsible, accountable, ought to be consulted or want to be informed. Very difficult stuff. But I think they're making progress, not as quickly as I'd like, and I have some concerns as to where they're going, but I think we're going to hear something pretty soon. I really do. Next slide, please. So I gave a version of this a month ago, and I'm going to update this. I would have thought a month ago that we'd have heard of the decisions by now. There are a lot of entities within DoD and the intelligence community who care about this. And there are some pretty strong opinions, I think, as to what is the best way to go forward and what ought to be changed and who ought to lead it. And some of those things involve kind of turf questions as to who gets to say what or when and who controls which. All of this is aggravated by the absence of critical leadership at positions that matter. We don't have an Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment. We don't have an Assistant Secretary of Acquisition and Sustainment. We don't have a present, full-time CISO for the Acquisition and Sustainment Group. That's the position Katie Arrington had. She's been suspended. Obviously, the DoD CIO's office has a great deal of interest and expertise in the subject, and a very capable individual, Mr. John Sherman's been nominated to become the CIO. But while his nomination is pending, he's not able to perform any of the duties of the CIO. So someone else, a deputy, is performing those duties. I have no question as to the competence and good intentions of all of those in DoD who are presently charged with determining the future and leading it for CMMC. But we are missing some key positions. And it's not just decision makers, but leadership. If you don't have the people at the right place to make the decisions, then you really don't have people with authority to lead. And that is a big problem. I wish I could tell you that I expected to see nominations for the absent positions at ANS soon, but I've been hoping for that for weeks, if not months now. I don't know what the problem is, but it should be solved. Now, why did they do this? Well, we've heard this before. They're concerned about cost, fairness, practicality, impact, and they want to make sure that the AB operates with integrity. What I've heard in the last month or so is the increased emphasis upon industrial base and access to innovation. These are really important to the department, above and beyond security. These go to essential national security capabilities. And so we have to have that in mind. The announced purposes of the review, pretty much as I said before, help solve the small business problem, bring some clarity to confusing and difficult regulations, reinforce trust in the assessment system, that is AB. Why have they been quiet? Well, it's pretty much as I've said on this column before, but as the intentions for change increase or expand, as the complexity of new decisions becomes realized, suddenly you understand that you're operating in a rulemaking environment. There is an interim rule out there, and you might consider the rule that was put out last September as setting a big box. Well, you can make changes within that box, but if you have ideas for the next generation of CMMC that weren't addressed in that rulemaking, you can't do it within that box. You're going to have to come up with new rulemaking, and I do expect that will occur. But coming up with decisions on what to do and determining which can be accomplished today, what can only be described today but must be accomplished later, that's pretty hard stuff. Now, I'm confident that the CMMC program will remain. I don't think that DoD intended to suspend it, but I think there's been a very unfortunate consequence of their extended silence. I continue to receive reports that many companies are simply standing by and waiting, and in the interim doing nothing. There's a lot of things wrong with that, not the least of which is that you are obliged to comply with the clauses presently in your contract, including 7012, 7019, 7020. Moreover, you have absolutely no reason to think that potential threats to your information confidentiality or integrity or availability are going to pause while DoD is figuring this out. Not so. How long is this going to last? Are we really going to get clarity when DoD makes its announcements? I don't think so. I think we will get a sense of direction. We will know some things that are emphasized and some things that are changed. But my present impression is that the nature and reach of the changes that are being contemplated are such, first, that it's going to take another year or year and a half before rulemaking is accomplished. Second, that there are going to be individual elements of changes that are going to be highly controversial. When announced, I think there are going to be people, me probably included, who think, well, I understand the problem, but I sure don't like the answer you've come up with. Does it mean that, yes, there's going to be CMMC? Yes, I think there will be assessments. Yes, those assessments will apply to a very large number of companies. But DoD is struggling with this problem that it's just too big, too hard, too expensive, too impactful on the wrong people, too much adverse consequence of a well-intentioned grand scale initiative. And as they find ways to shrink, reduce, or change things, they're going to make some decisions on what to keep and what not to that are going to be debatable, and which I expect some in the security community are not going to like, present company included. Should you stop performance now? I won't repeat this. You already are subject to 7012, which requires adequate security in a dynamic environment. And although it's sometimes overlooked, 7012 also requires incident reporting within 72 hours. Now, unless you've not read any of the trade press or the papers for the last 6 months, you are certainly aware that almost every day, or nearly every day, there's some announcement from some administration official about the importance of public-private partnerships or cooperation to make sure that incidents are reported much more quickly. And there's increased emphasis at the executive level on incident reporting to help the government respond to the incidents by understanding the nature of attack and communicating to others at risk how to fix it. And there's talk of legislation covering a number of critical infrastructure sectors that might require reporting within 24 hours. Well, if you're a defense contractor and you compare that to what is in the 7012 clause, you ought to be thinking, gosh, we got it easy. And in a strange sense, you do. Because the 7012 clause does have a reporting obligation. It says if you have a cyber incident, you have to report to DC3 within 72 hours. Well, 72 hours in the present environment is considered a very long time. And I've had a pretty good authority that the actual rate of reports of cyber incidents to DIPCAC to DC3 is pretty small. I also know to a certainty that the original focus of the 7012 incident reporting was not to tell others how to avoid what happened to you. It was to do an assessment of the impact to the mission of the information that was stolen. That's still part of it. But what has changed more generally, and I think will reach into our DoD environment, is an emphasis, first, timely and full reporting. Second, a recognition that one of the things to be achieved with timely and full reporting is an understanding of the threat and the ability to distribute response information quickly. And right now, nothing in the 7012 or CMMC apparatus really covers those things well enough. So that's why I'm saying that, for all the trouble, trauma, turmoil, and doubt that we have for CMMC, it's just part of what's coming or what we need to do. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some subjects to consider, and I'm going to go through these relatively quickly. Next slide, please. There's the first group of things that are more likely to occur in my prediction. I don't know these things to be true. The second slide are things that I really hope will occur where I'm a little less confident. And then I want to talk about some distinct issues such as the Justice Department issue. So you've heard me kind of explain the context. Yes, we need security. No, we're not going to trust a attestation where it matters to us. We need better security. We want to make sure that people conform to the requirements that have been well established. And we need to rely on something other than people just attesting by taking a contract that they're doing it. But we have to deal with implausibility or unattainability of the earlier campaign. So what I think is going to happen is that if there are 300,000 companies that are potentially subject to assessment, now I think when this new initiative is announced and underway, we're going to see that fewer are subject to the requirements. We talked earlier about those distinctions between levels 1 through 5. Well, level 1 is the lowest maturity, but level 1 is also intended to apply to companies who get federal contract information or subject to the basic DFARS safeguarding clause. But those are not the same as companies who get controlled or unclassified information and are subject to 7012 under DoD clause. I've said for more than a year that it struck me as overambitious to insist upon assessment of the hundreds of thousands of companies who get only federal contract information, don't get CUI. I think it's great to have a maturity model for level 1. Important that we have the FAR that offers 15 basic safeguards. But if I am limited in resources and time, I'm going to want to concentrate those resources on things that matter more to me. And that would remove level 1 from required assessment. I don't think level 1 will get a free pass. It's possible even that people at level 1 might in time be required to do a self-assessment against those 15 FAR requirements and report on that via SIPRs. But I think we'll see that the CMMC effort, as such, focusing not on level 1 or level 2, but on level 3. Also, I think that it's proving quite difficult just to accomplish the level 3 objectives, even the 110 requirements that are in NIST SP 800-171. And some have said that those plus 20 policies and practices for CMMC level 3, they've said those things are really too hard and expensive. It can't be done by some people. So what I think happens here is at the top end, I think what's in CMMC level 4 and level 5 maybe will be separated from the near-term CMMC program. It isn't that there are companies who need to have that kind of maturity and capability. There is another standard that NIST produced, SP 800-172, is intended to address those higher level capabilities. My expectation is that DoD will separately require higher level security when it considers a program or contract or technology to require it. And I would expect that the DoD will be looking to 172 in this document rather than the CMMC maturity level 4 or 5. Within the level 3 group, as I said, it could be 60 to 75,000. Well, if I'm right, and that's just too many to do with the resources we have without waiting a very long time to grow a much, much larger resource base. Well, it seems to me it would make sense to set some priorities as to what you're trying to protect first, which supply chains, what products, what programs, what technology. And it could be that they'll make some separation within that level 3 group. Perhaps there will be a group that is going to get assessed sooner, another group that gets assessed later. And I would not rule out the possibility that there could be some at level 3 who will have no present reason to expect an assessment requirement, even if it remains a possibility in the more distant future. Does that mean that the whole CMMC industry of consultants, advisors, supporters, and lawyers should suddenly close the tents and head home? No, absolutely not. Because even if such changes reduce the number of companies to be assessed to just 20,000 or just 10,000, that's a huge amount of work. And there will be some smaller companies who not only will have to have it, but some, perhaps many, who will want to have it. Because ultimately, security, if accomplished and demonstrated, is a positive discriminator to the DoD customer and ought to be a positive discriminator to higher ups in your supply chain and to your other customers. The pace of the rollout, well, I mean, we have 5 C3POs. It cannot operate at the pace that was suggested by that table. So I think we're going to be kind of see a slower rollout with the number of companies expected to be assessed more in line with the resources that will be available. Now, what about the requirements themselves? Well, everybody knows that NIST SB 800-171 has been around for 5 or 6 years, and it's been subject to 2 revisions. And, reduced to its elementals, it has 110 requirements, either basic or derived, each expressed in a single sentence. I think it surprises a lot of people how hard it has been to achieve it. Well, there is a body of thought that says that the DoD ought to focus industry's attention on just 171. That going beyond 171 for now is just too hard, too expensive. Well, so we may see some greater emphasis of 171 and maybe lesser emphasis of the CMMC maturity models. I'm not sure that's a good idea, but I think it could happen. Personally, I like the so-called plus 20 in CMMC level 3, particularly like a group of requirements that to me are clearly targeted at and will help with the ransomware threat. And I think it would be a mistake if those were not to be retained in the requirements, even if not immediately, then soon. I also like the idea of promoting not just compliance with a list of enumerated requirements, but also recognizing and encouraging progression and maturity. It's true that you can't assess progression on a day-to-day basis, and it's true that maturity, is somewhat different, than assessment and certification. But I think it's still a valuable aim for the overall construct to be seeking not just compliance at the moment of assessment and certification, but improving maturity, which to me implies agility and ability to respond to threats as they evolve. Standards already known in practice. That's where I kind of mentioned that. That's the thought that maybe we need to look more to NIST, or maybe we should be looking to NIST to give us a new version of 171 rather than rely on maturity level 3. I don't know. A lot of work went into those maturity levels, a lot of content that's there. Relief to small business, I continue to hear about it. Well, the easiest relief is to make sure that a smaller number of small businesses look forward to assessment. So if you cut the number of companies from 300,000 to say 30,000 that are going to be assessed, and that has the effect of reducing the number of small businesses expecting assessment by say 60, 70%, well, that's relief. If you don't have to do it, you're relieved from it. If you are put into a category of lower risk, such that you might be subject to a level 3 or 171, but not have assessment in the near term, well, I mean, that kind of reduces the demand also. DoD continues to talk about all kinds of other things to help small business. There's a lot of emphasis upon toolkits. I think there already are a lot of toolkits. I also, continue to hear talk, as we have for a year or more, about DoD setting up enclaves, cloud enclaves. And I think that's actually a good idea, but I don't know why DoD needs to do it. There are any number of highly capable managed service providers and cloud service providers who can, and I think some who already are able to offer enclaves that are tailored for small business. All in all, I have a lot more confidence in the private sector and its ability to figure out how to do this and to make it affordable than I would in asking DoD to assume functions that the private sector can do, should do, and probably will do better. I do think the AB is going to remain with us. I give a lot of credit to Matt Travis and the team for all that they've accomplished. I think their central role has been and will remain the training of assessors and their accreditation and their assignment. In the end, I expect that the AB's role will change somewhat and probably be limited somewhat. Issues of decision as to the adequacy or correctness of a contested assessment, I don't think those are going to be made by the AB. I think those are going to move over to DoD. I also hope that the long-awaited scoping guidance is going to come out of DoD. We just have to have that. The scoping guidance tells so many things without which it's hard to do this. If you don't have the scoping guidance, then the assessors really don't know what to look at, how far in an enterprise to go, or what within an enterprise they're supposed to assess. And from the enterprise standpoint, among other things, the scoping guidance hopefully will give you some idea of which part of your enterprise that has some or different, greater or lesser relationship to DoD is, within the assessment or certification boundary, and what isn't. For complex organizations, for whom DoD is just a small part of their business, it's a gigantic difference should all of the organization be within the scoping guidance as opposed to just that part that works on DoD contracts. Absence of certainty on this subject has been profoundly frustrating. Next slide, please. So this next group is the things that I would have hoped, 3 months ago, I might have said, well, of course they're going to do these because they have to. Well, no, I'm not so sure. I wrote a paper that Exostar was kind enough to sponsor. It's a little bit out of date, but only a little, in 2016 on cloud security and satisfying the 7012 DFARS clause. It was about 15,000 words, and it was distilled to these simple propositions. You can do a better job with cloud because of scale and collection of resources and agility. You can do a much better job at security cloud than you're likely to do with a premises system. And DoD ought to facilitate people using the cloud rather than make it ambiguous or frustrated. Well, I wish I could say that that message was finally taken, that these issues are solved, but I still hear the same things being said. I still hear talk about, well, we're going to figure out what's equivalent and acceptable. And we're finally going to deal with reciprocity between security for DoD and security accomplished under other regimes. And I also hear, talk, well, managed service providers play a key role, but we're not really sure what security we're going to provide of them. This is extremely frustrating to me. And to me, it's against DoD's own interest in a number of ways. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but to me, one of the best ways to help smaller businesses is to encourage managed service providers and cloud service providers and perhaps others to come up with things that are packaged, that rely upon an already certified and trustworthy cloud, that essentially deploy to the small business solutions that are prepackaged where a high number of the requisite approvals are already in place. I mean, if there's 110 things you have to do and 70 of them are achieved through the package that you get through an Exostar or Microsoft or an AWS, well, I mean, if you reduce the requirements that are specific to and must be performed by the business, the client, well, I think it makes it more likely not only that they will pass an assessment, but more important that they actually will have adequate security in a dynamic environment. This is still frustrating. There's one of the problems for DoD is that it has far from a free hand. Everywhere you look, there's another rule, policy, instruction, and requirement. DoD, of course, wants to get these assessment reports from the assessors so that it can determine whether the certificate should be granted if it makes that decision. And it is possible. It's possible that the assessors will end up saying, we have done this assessment and we conclude that this entity is ready for certification. It's possible that DoD will make that. Well, any time that you actually ask for records from more than 10 people, that's it, 10 people, then the Paperwork Reduction Act comes into play. And DoD has gotten approval to get information submitted to SIPRs on that self-assessment. But if you start to look at other ways in which DoD is going to get information from the private sector, where it's expected or compelled by regulation, well, then you got to navigate this Paperwork Reduction Act and other things, and those things are time-consuming and will affect, what DoD is, how DoD gets information and what it can do with it until it has addressed those rulemaking requirements. 2021 was supposed to be the year of pilot programs. I don't think they happened. They didn't happen for a couple reasons. One was that there wasn't any assessors. Probably by the time that got around to having a few assessors, those particular acquisitions had moved on such that they were no longer good candidates. Well, the theory of the pilot programs was that we would, learn from those and then go forward. But if we start learning in 2022, that means we don't actually start to assess anybody in the ordinary course of commerce until 2023, and time does matter. So, it's conceivable that if I'm right and they set up some tiers and priorities, if they tend to limit the number of companies that are going to get assessed, it's possible that they will maybe, do a few pilots or maybe not. I mean, maybe they'll just sort of go right from this is what we have in the future, and these are the types of contracts and programs that are going to be subject to this new program. I should mention here, if I haven't already, I did mention, but I'll mention it again. So let's suppose that all the things on this slide and the previous slide are included in DoD's new policies. And suppose hypothetically that they're all included in an announcement. Well, there's, some number of those that you can do by announcement, and some number of those that you can accomplish by finalizing the existing pending interim regulation. But a fair number of the things that are on this list are things that you can announce now. There are going to be some which you really can't do or can't compel until you do that new rulemaking. And DoD has to sort that out because people are going to want to know, obviously, what do I have to do now? What can I expect to have to do soon? And, where do I get a chance on new and different things to offer my opinion before you decide? That's what rulemaking is supposed to do. Well, I would hope that we would increase recognition and use of international standards so that we're not just wrapped around the proverbial axle of, federal unique or specific standards, and that applies to cloud. I think FedRAMP is a terrific mechanism. But overall, the administration wants to move more of our agencies and departments to the cloud and do so more quickly. And it wants to use FedRAMP to improve the security of those. And at the same time, we're trying to use more cloud here to help companies get, accomplished in CMMC. Well, I don't think there's any plausible way to increase the size or rate of passage through FedRAMP. And I don't understand it in any case. And I haven't since I wrote that paper in 2016. And there are many other mechanisms and authorities, bodies and entities that have a means to assess and validate cloud security other than FedRAMP that are relied upon by thousands of cloud service providers and hundreds of thousands of companies worldwide every day. And if we really want to get to the use of cloud and make this thing fast, which I think we should, fast but smart, then we got to start thinking a little bit outside that box of just using FedRAMP, federal standards and processes. Alternative methods for higher security, I kind of covered that. Yes, there are some companies, programs, projects, and technologies where 171 and the existing 7012 aren't even close, and DoD knows that, and they're going to deal with those separately. I think those things will tend to move away from the CMMC program. I mentioned that under the basic safeguarding clause, you were, to meet 15 safeguarding requirements, which I guess translate to 17 practices. Maturity level 1 and CMMC elaborates on that a lot. If this principle of, triage or concentration of resources on critical assets, if that principle applies, I think you're going to see some separation of maturity level 1, and I don't think we'll see assessment in the form that has been contemplated. Improving DoD resources and responsiveness, please. One of the big problems here is that there is a small number of dedicated people in DoD that are working on this, working incredibly hard. Sometimes I think ridiculously hard, because there's just not enough people and not enough money in DoD. If you actually went back and looked at those slides early on about the program schedule, and you weren't given the a label as to what it is, you would think, well, gee, I'm looking at the new system development plan and resource chart and overall project schedule for the hypersonic next generation weapon. It looks kind of like a program of record at a distance, but most of the work is being done by the private sector. All of the funding of the AP is being done by the private sector, and DoD is the responsible for the CMMC program is, relatively speaking, in my judgment, not invested enough. And if it's going to lead this program to success, we need the leadership, and we need more resources within DoD or under contract to DoD to help get it done. We've all been concerned for some time about the theory of Katie Arrington. I understand why she said it, and I'm not critical of it. But her theory was, hey, industry, we've been telling you for years that you're subject to 171. You've taken these contracts saying you're delivering adequate security and you're in compliance. So don't tell me that you want a plan of action and milestones, that you have a gap, that you need more time to do this or do that. When you come to the CMMC table, you need to come with all the cards and everything's satisfied. You don't get 100% in your assessment, you don't get the certification. I am sympathetic to the logic of that, but in practice, it's really never been workable. It not only may punish a company disproportionately, it may also punish the supply chain in which it's a participant, and it certainly may punish the program office or the requiring activity or the mission holder. And so there's got to be some flexibility introduced into the system. Not too much, but some. I don't know whether that's resolved or not. But in other areas of regulation that have strong measures, such as are contemplated here, it's not uncommon to have means for temporary relief from a requirement until you get it fixed, or even to have a means to get a waiver of certain requirements entirely. And this is an area that's not immune from such problems. I wrote separately about areas of misfit between 171 and maturity level 3 and operational technology. There are certain aspects of 171 and operational technology which just cannot be connected to or accomplished in at least some factories and industrial control settings. And so in that situation, if that company were to fail because it can't do those things literally, don't you think we need something like a waiver or some other established mechanism so that what they can do is assessed as valid for its own sake and not disqualifying because of what can't be accomplished given the system's affected? Now you would say, well, you think that, these things are all reasonable, they should all do them. Well, I think everybody on this call probably has had some idea of something that's really reasonable and sensible where there's a consensus. And we have been waiting to see that those things get done, and they have not been done. So there is a long and bumpy road ahead of us. And as frustrating as that is, I want to go back to that original equation: risk, threat, vulnerability, consequence, all terrible. And if it were better, if the world was nice, well, we wouldn't have to deal with these hard problems. But it's not better, and the world isn't nice. Now, on the last one, I should have put this in red with flashing lights. We still don't know who actually really, legally or practically is responsible to identify and designate controlled and classified information. I find it incredible that we could be several years into this and still have, I think, a large majority of contractors wondering, are they going to tell me what it is? Is it their responsibility to tell me? Do I decide myself? What about stuff that I've never delivered to the government? What about stuff that's just records I keep in the ordinary course of business? I mean, just how do I know what is CUI and what isn't? Well, it certainly matters because, if CUI were limited just to the things that you make for or are given by the Department of Defense, well, securing that much narrower set of information would be easier to do, I think, and more successful. But if you have this expansive definition and you leave it entirely to guesswork, you're going to get inconsistent results. And potentially companies are going to spend a whole lot of money trying to protect an awful lot of stuff, which may be important to protect, some of which has to be protected for other reasons like healthcare records, but which really isn't so essential to protect for the interest of the Department of Defense and its mission holders. Next slide, please. So some new things. Got a little bit of a correction here on my screen. Okay, the Civil Fraud Initiative. So when this was first announced, Deputy Attorney General Monaco announced it, and I first heard it and I said, well, I mean, it's a lot easier to say that you're going to, prosecute civil fraud cases and succeed on them than it is to do it. Over history, there's been a very, very small number of successful cyber civil fraud cases, very, very small. And there's been a number of reasons for that. One was, a question of whether it was even a material requirement of your contract. If everybody got the 170.12 clause over a period of years, and if DoD wasn't expecting anybody to actually be fully compliant and wasn't doing anything about it, even when it has cause to suspect, well, this leads to the argument that, okay, it's a requirement, but it's not material to their decision to do business with me. And, if they're still paying me and they know that I have uncertain cyber, if they're paying everybody else and their cyber isn't any good, okay, it's there, but it's not a material requirement. Well, that's been a defense that's been advanced by Aerojet in a pending civil fraud case that's in California. We could talk about that longer, but I don't have time. Another issue was, okay, so suppose we treat this requirement as material, state of mind. I mean, you don't commit fraud simply because a bad thing happens. There has to be some knowing or purposeful conduct, or at the very least reckless disregard. And in situations where a company is blindsided with a zero-day attack and had no reason to expect it and no knowledge of what it was when it happened, or even an immediate consequence thereafter, well, I mean, what's the fraud there if you're surprised and confused and don't know what to do? And still another thing is to say, well, if I'm a company and I'm looking at this sea of requirements, and there's 13 of them where I have an internal debate between my technical lead and subordinate, between Department 1 and Department 3, between this officer and that, and where the consultants don't agree with the in-house staff, And if there is no actual expert objective opinion on what is the right interpretation or the only responsible course of action, well, how can I possibly make a fraudulent decision if the requirements themselves are under debate and there are many reasonable choices as to how to respond to them? And then you get to the question of damages. Well, okay, I mean, suppose hypothetically that there's a basis for fraud. Let's hope not. Well, I mean, what's the government's damage? I mean, is there a damage just because I'm vulnerable if I'm not breached? Is there a damage because I am breached, but we don't know whether any information was exfiltrated? Is there damage whether I'm vulnerable, I'm breached, information was exfiltrated, but we don't know who got it or what they did with it? You can see that at any of those points, there's a question of what's the damage? Well, I've given some further thought to DOJ's announcement and looked at this October 13th statement of the Assistant Attorney General at the CISO Summit. And I think there is more to it. I don't consider this alarming or game-changing, but I do think it is game-influencing. He describes that there are 3 common cyber failures, which they think of as well-suited for the False Claims Act. Knowing failure to comply with security standards, knowing misrepresentation of security controls and practices, and knowing failure to timely report suspected breaches. Now, when you dissect, this announcement, the specialists will find 100 things that aren't quite connected, where the slogans are used, correctly, but applied incorrectly to circumstance. They talk about knowing failure to comply with security standards. He was talking about when the government buys cybersecurity products or services. But I think we can, extract from that these are the 3 themes. And look, it's hard to comply with cyber requirements. They are changing. Threat environments changing. And so there are situations where a company could be presented with options to comply and decide not to. Well, maybe that's reasonable. But if you had facts where you were aware of vulnerabilities, if you were told by a consultant that your cyber was no good, and you just determined that you weren't going to do anything because you're waiting for CMMC to clarify, well, you're veering towards that knowing failure to comply. And then on misrepresentation, I mean, this puts a sudden shade or maybe a spotlight on SPRS. Okay, so we do that self-assessment, we give them our score, and we tell them when we're going to close our gaps, and we describe the system that we've studied. Well, I mean, if we did that and put in numbers we knew were wrong, if we provided a date to close the gaps that we had no intention to accomplish, and if we deliberately created some artificial boundaries to limit what we were submitting this information about, well, I mean, somebody could say that's a knowing misrepresentation of security controls and practices. And if we stop at just those things, I mean, just the announcement of this program suddenly does make a change in that materiality calculus. I said that it's hard to accomplish or hard to establish civil fraud, unless the requirement is material. Well, if the Department of Justice is out there saying this stuff loudly and creating this new task force to prosecute it, suddenly the arguments that knowing misrepresentation, knowing failure, suddenly those arguments that those things are material start to look a little better. And then interestingly, they also said knowing failure to timely report suspected breaches. And that ought to weigh pretty heavily, because I think there's a zillion instances when companies might have enough information to report something and decide that they don't have to, or that they won't because there won't be any consequence. Well, this is why maybe the landscape has shifted a bit. So if I'm a compliance person at a company and I'm hearing debates as to whether to do or not do, or spend or not spend, or comply or avoid, I'm going to be a little worried about this. Not so much that the Justice Department tomorrow is going to, show up with a subpoena, but I'm going to be more worried that somebody inside my company or a consultant maybe working for it is going to be so upset with what they think to be a bad decision that they're going to report it to DOJ. And as part of the Civil Cyber Fraud Initiative, DOJ has done us the favor of setting up a special hotline at DOJ to report cyber fraud. And so the fact there could be whistleblowers, or that ordinary disagreements could be construed as, deliberate avoidance of known requirements, that's going to get people's attention. And I think it's going to shift the balance towards, saying something sooner, doing something more, and being more careful about both what you initially submit on SIPRs and maybe when you update it. Now, whistleblowers are an important factor. I will tell, part of my real practice as a lawyer is defending these things. And I can tell you, after, several decades of experience, that it is a uniformly horrible experience for a company to be on the receiving end of a False Claims Act allegation, whether it's brought by a whistleblower or certainly if it's brought by the Justice Department. You don't ever want to be there. And there is also pretty substantial exposure, irrespective of those damages questions I raised. Now there's triple damages, but if you can't calculate the damage, that doesn't mean so much. However, the theory of the Justice Department has been that every invoice you submit, if you falsely represented compliance with a cybersecurity standard, every one of those is subject to a penalty of up to $23,331 a claim. Well, at 100 invoices or 1,000 invoices, those numbers become pretty meaningful, plus the cost of defense, which is painful. So we got to pay attention to this. Now, I'm going to go over these last three in a grand total of 1 minute. They're sort of embedded, or at least that's my story. Role of private parties and public-private partnership. Endlessly, everywhere else in the government, this administration recognizes that we're not going to solve our security problems, including ransomware, unless we do it as a public-private partnership, and that we need to accomplish more by motivating companies to volunteer information and to act in their best interest in ways that are consistent with the national interest. DoD seems to be in a little bit different domain, where it's continuing to focus upon emphasis upon requirements and obligations. In the end, successful security is a partnership. Yes, there's a place for regulations and requirements, but there's a little more to it than that, especially if you're trying to not just comply with a regulation, but to actually achieve the security and have the benefits of that security for your customers and for your enterprise itself. Managed service providers and consultants, we just got to deal with that. I think managed service providers and consultants are essential and are only going to become more so, especially if we finally find the means to encourage the use of cloud services of various types. These are rarely things that companies can do themselves. They're going to rely upon managed service providers and informed consultants. And so, we want to look to those people and come up with ways to make sure that they do not themselves become a security vulnerability. Roles and responsibilities of the AB, it needs to get itself aligned with international standards. It's working on it. It needs to focus upon training, accreditation of the assessors, management of those resources. Choices and courses of action for industry now, at the very least, continue to work on 171. And, you can do the minimum or you can do better. And, if you look to the 171A assessment guide, it gives you a pretty good idea of kind of what DoD at least would expect. And if you look to maturity level 3, it gives you some things that are, I think, improvements upon 171. Even if you don't know when or whether you'll ever have an assessment, if you have a strong answer to 171 requirements and you improve upon it by getting into those plus 20 from level 3, I think you've done yourself a great favor by protecting your intellectual property and sensitive information. I think you've done a lot to make your customers more confident of your availability and the integrity of your work. And I think you've reduced your risk of non-compliance or regulatory exposure. So my answer is, even though we're still going to be frustrated, have our doubts, be disappointed, and wonder what the hell DoD is doing, even after announcement of the next generation, I think the center course of what to do is pretty clear. Last slide, I'm just going to show it. I know we're over time. The reason that I'm going to show it is that this is all the other stuff, and it's all there, right? I'm not going to go through these, but I want to make this point, and it's a point that I'm making and that senior officials in the department make as well. CMMC is important; it has its place, but it's just a part of it. A holistic solution to the real world range of cybersecurity threats and consequences is bigger and different. And so all these other things that are on this slide, these are things that forward-looking companies ought to be considering now, because one way or the other, DoD or some other federal agency is going to be hoping for, looking to, expecting, potentially requiring that these things be done. And really, if they're not done, then we just sustain our vulnerabilities in a different way, a dangerous outcome where our attackers have proven to be so numerous, diverse, and resourceful. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. That was an excellent presentation. It's definitely timely. I know we're still, waiting to hear a lot of the feedback of what's to come from the DoD. For those that are hung here with us throughout the presentation, please go to the exit poll. It's down in the YouTube description we don't have time for Q&A today. I want to respect the top of the hour. Feel free to reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. We do have the pre-submitted questions, so we'll start working through those separately. And we've also, if you request a copy of the slide deck, there's a lot of useful links here, both from the DoD, the accreditation body, some of our partners that we have that can help you on the cybersecurity front and being prepared for 171 or CMMC. Then for some of our free solutions, the one thing I do want to call out was Certification Assistant. There's a free trial, but it not only helps with the SPURS scoring, but generating all the artifacts. So you have an audit trail of how you did it, and as you improve your scores, you have that audit trail, which is very important given that you're now submitting that data to the government. Once again, I want to thank you. This is a wrap for today, and please do the poll, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much,
Thank you.
everyone.